And as always on these issues, I think one of the best people to weigh in on them is our friend Andy McCarthy, who is author of the bestseller Injustice, and he's former chief assistant U.S. attorney. You see him on Fox and everywhere else. Andy, so good to see you, and I'm so grateful to be able to call upon you to weigh in on this, because what is the truth of this matter? What is your opinion of this suit?
That it's legally frivolous, but the underlying claims are something to be very concerned about. I say it's legally frivolous, Dana, because let's put aside the seriousness of things like insecure election procedures, signature matching, identification procedures, etc. As a strict legal matter, Texas doesn't have standing to complain about the election procedures in other states, because what the Constitution gives to each state is that state's electoral votes. You don't have a to go complain about how another state enforces its own laws. That doesn't mean that they have no remedy. What it means is they're not going to find a remedy in the court. And as we might say in the Bronx, they're not going to get the court to do the heavy lifting for them.
Yeah.
What will happen is on January 6th, Congress meets to count the votes. And at that point, if Texas and 17 or 18 other states think that these four states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Georgia, thinks that their votes shouldn't count because their election procedures were not up to snuff, they can object when Congress meets to count the votes to the inclusion of those states in the Electoral College tally. And that way, the protest is made and the objection is lodged by officials who are politically accountable to voters. But they are not going to get the Supreme Court or any court to do it for them.
Yeah, and I think that's the big question. Like, what is the remedy? What would be what is the course of that? And I appreciate the distinction too, that really ultimately this is also contesting the electors, not so much anything else. And while I understand the argument that's made by some, Andy, and this is, and we have a lot of mutual friends who have made this argument, and a lot of mutual friends who've disagreed with it, that, well, what happens in another state affects the outcome of that in yet another state. So if some other state is, acting with impropriety, and as a result of this, questionable conclusion, that there could be people in another state disenfranchised. But at the same time, and this is what Congressman Chip Roy from Texas brings up, there is a potential to establish a very dangerous precedent to nationalize elections. And as conservatives, people who are about conserving individual liberty and authority of the states, that should be something we should be on guard about. Talk to us a little bit about how this would kind of open that doorway.
Yeah, it's actually even worse. Chip is quite right about this. And what's being proposed here is even worse, because if you remember at the beginning of this Congress, the first thing the House Democrats tried to do out of the box was essentially federalize our elections and have Congress prescribe all kinds of procedures that, of course, favored the left that everybody would have to adopt in connection with elections. And Republicans were up in arms about that, and I think rightly so. What they're now proposing to do, though, and maybe they haven't thought this through, is instead of having Congress do it, where at least we'd have a debate and a vote and everybody would be represented, they're basically going to the court and asking the court to impose some solution on this. And if it's okay for Texas to sue Michigan over the way Michigan conducts its voting, why can't California, which, for example, thinks that Texas's voter identification procedures disenfranchise voters in Texas, and that would hurt the Democratic candidate that California would prefer to see win? Why can't California just file a lawsuit against Texas in the Supreme Court? I mean, you could see where this goes. Eventually, what you're going to have is all the red states are going to file their actions against the blue states, and the blue states are going to file against the red states. And, if they had their way, the court would impose a solution. I think happily, this Supreme Court doesn't want anything to do with a political hot potato like that. They wouldn't get near, for example, gerrymandering, this politicized district drawing. And this is like gerrymandering times 10. So I don't see them wanting to get involved in this.
Yeah, and does it matter too? We're speaking with Andy McCarthy, who's author of the bestseller Injustice, and you see him on Fox and read him at NRO and elsewhere. I know that there's some debate as to with the states that, well, their election results or their decision to have this, certify this and get their electors seated, et cetera, that it should be discounted if it doesn't go through the legislative process as opposed to having it determined judicially, because we know Democrats were litigating this using the pandemic to justify the mail-in ballots. Is there any justification to that? I mean, is that something still that states can reserve the right apart from the nation to determine?
Yeah, it's a very significant issue whether the election procedures that each state follows are the procedures that are prescribed in law by the state legislature, as opposed to, say, imposed by a bureaucracy like a board of electors or a court. Because the Constitution says it's up to the state legislatures to decide the rules under which elections take place in each state. Now, for well over a century, every state who we've had for that long has their legislatures have given the public the right to vote in elections, which is why we have 50 different state elections. But we should remember, we don't have one national election. We have 50 different state elections. So the Constitution does assume that the state governments are going to exercise control over this process as they traditionally have. But that has to be done by the legislature. And every legislature, Dana, has long ago enacted a bunch of procedures on how elections get carried out. They get tweaked from time to time, but they give a lot of authority to the executive branch officials, especially the governor and the secretary of state in each state. And of course, they've given the vote to the public. So once you give the vote to the public, you don't want to be in a position of changing the law in a way that disenfranchises the voters. So that's obviously something they need to be careful about.
Right. We're talking with our friend Andy McCarthy. Andy, if the Supreme Court isn't the best forum to settle this dispute between Texas and the other states, I know you mentioned Congress as well. There are some who say, well, Congress is just as partisan as these states that ran these elections to where you had all of these irregularities and now it's being contested. What other alternatives are there?
It should be political. It should be partisan because it's a political process. This is not like a question of did somebody breach a contract or should three defendants be tried together or should they get separate trials? This is not something where you have justiciable legal standards that you can bring to bear and decide it. This is kind of the quintessential political process. Voting, a self-determining people voting to elect a president and a vice president who are really the only officials that we as a country actually vote for, although we do it state by state, not in one big popular election. So it doesn't offend me at all, Dana, that the ultimate place this gets decided is by Congress, because it's a political process. It ought to be decided by the political branches. And while it's true that everybody's got partisan motivations, right? So you might think as a knee-jerk matter, well, I guess all the Republicans will go in and if we're going to do this now, vote in a way that strips the blue states of their seats. But, when you start to think about this, you realize that if what you do to them, they do to you, right? Yeah. That's why politics works. So I think if there's a profound issue about whether a state's election has integrity, there's a lot of talk about Pennsylvania, for example. Biden won Pennsylvania by 80,000 votes. There's a lot of talk about Michigan. I think Biden won Michigan by, 150,000, maybe more than that. So, you have to weigh whether you're concerned about their procedures, which I think everybody should be, especially this mass use of mail-in, versus how big of the margin or how big was the margin of victory. And then as someone who's going to be accountable for the vote, whether you take that state's electoral votes, you've got to think long and hard before you say, I don't think we should count Pennsylvania's votes, because what you do to Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania can do to you.
That's
so
true.
I think like most things that happen in politics, there's always partisanship and there's always grandstanding. But in the end, we use that process because it works.
Right.
And unlike legal processes, it lends itself to compromise in a way that, legal processes are tough for complicated problems because the law has to be rational. You have to, in a linear way with the law, you have to be able to get from A to B to C reasonably, reasoning through a problem. In politics, you have no obligation to be rational, as has been obvious from 200 years of history. But that's so that we can compromise and live together as a pluralistic society that has some tensions, but all in all is one country. And just because it's politics, to me, that doesn't mean it's a bad process. It's a good process.
It's a feature of the system, not a bug. And I do kind of sometimes think it's weird when we default to go into the courts as opposed to relying on holding Americans accountable. I mean, yes, there might be partisanship, but also at the same time, isn't that what you have the responsibility and freedom to hold accountable as a citizen? I mean, it's civic participation, which I think we have a deficit of in this country. Last question for you, Andy. I feel like Republicans are missing the bigger picture of mail-in ballots because you had Democrats going state by state by state to litigate this and to establish this in all of these different states. And I see us focusing on the big picture of the general election, but not so much what I think is really the issue that is going to have repercussions for many elections, the mail-in ballots and the validity of that. Is that, do you agree with that? Are we just missing that boat?
We have been missing it. And I think this is kind of a function of a left versus right thing.
Yeah.
The progressives, I think, eat, sleep, drink, and breathe. How do we change the system? How do we move the system? And they're very political that way. They're sort of hardwired to be that way. We want to be left alone, and we don't tend to deal with a problem until we realize it's a problem. And by that time, sometimes it's a 5-alarm fire, whereas they're always thinking about how do we make the 5-alarm fires. So here we are with I don't know if this is a 5-alarm fire. We'll have to see, at the end of all of these fact-finding processes, how many of these states have problems that we really have to worry about their election integrity. But I think going forward, if this is not a wake-up call for people about the potential for fraud, if we don't fix our procedures, and it's not just mail-in, mail-in is a problem. But to me, it's what they do after the mail-in, especially the things like signature matching and identification and all that stuff. Personally, I think we should all vote at the same time on the basis of the same information in the same way.
Agree.
And I would like to see us go back to the old mail-in system where you got an absentee ballot if you had a justifiable reason for getting one. But otherwise, you get your butt to the poll and vote, because there's a lot of countries where they crawl over glass to be able to vote.
That's right. I co-sign. I completely agree with that. That should be a focus. That should absolutely be a focus. Andy McCarthy, author of the bestseller Injustice. Andy, always so good to see you. Thank you, my friend, for your perspective.